Good afternoon. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good afternoon. I'm pleased to turn this over to Manya Pashman, host of AJC's People of the Pod.
Welcome to this live recording of American Jewish Committee's award-winning podcast, People of the Pod. Election season in Europe is in full force, including recent elections in France, the United Kingdom, and the European Parliament. American Jewish Committee's offices across Europe have closely followed the dramatic results across the continent. Joining us to share what these developments mean for Israel and the Jewish people is someone who has become a fairly regular guest thanks to her expertise, AJC Europe Managing Director, Simone Rodan-Benzaquen. Simone, welcome back to People of the Pod.
Thank you very much, Manya. It's very good to be with you.
So let's start with the most recent election in France, which is home to the second largest diaspora Jewish community behind the U.S. president, or behind the United States. So President Emmanuel Macron surprised a lot of people by calling for a snap election after his party was pummeled by the far right in European Parliament elections. Why was a snap election his solution, and what was the outcome?
It's a good question. I'm obviously not in President Macron's head. I think nobody is. But I can tell you what the president said, and I can try and give you a little bit of an interpretation of what I think and what people think. So the president has said that after the European parliamentary elections, which you indeed said have been a huge failure for his party. He only gained 17% of the French vote, while the far right gained 33%, that he wanted to use this occasion to give back the voice to the people and use it basically as a means to clarify the situation. Now, there has been a little bit of clarification. So the one clarification I'd say is the fact that after the first round, where it became very clear that the far right is gaining more and more weight within the French public opinion, and therefore possibly also in parliament, where it was expected that the far right would become the first party and possibly be able to have a government. The clarification was nevertheless that the majority of the country doesn't want the national rally, meaning the far right, to rule the country. It has also been a clarification because it has also showed that to some extent the National Front is probably not yet ready to rule, apart from the fact that the people, majority of the people don't believe it should be, because nearly 100 candidates were, as one could say, problematic. Some of them had a criminal past, some of them had made anti-Semitic, racist statements in the past, some of them were truly not very competent, basically be able to broke down in all of the interviews or the confrontations, not being able to respond to any of the questions. So that was, I'd say, one part of the clarification. The other part of the clarification, which is to some extent problematic and brings us to the situation we're in today, is the fact that France is now clearly split into, I'd say, three blocks: the far right, which is strong; the center, and the left. And so just to give you a little bit of an understanding of what the results look like after the second round of the elections. So it gave what we call the NFP, basically an alliance of all of the left parties, the far left, the Socialist Party, the Greens, and the Communists, 182 seats in the 577 seat National Assembly. A majority is needed, so of 289 seats. So they only have, as the largest bloc, 182 seats. Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party has, again, despite the fact that they were expecting to win only 143 seats, nevertheless gaining 50 seats compared to the previous election. And for President Macron's party, the results come as something probably of a relief, because they have 168 seats, down from the 250 seats it held in the outgoing parliament, but still far more than what people were expecting. So we now have basically, three scenarios. We have, in theory, a left bloc that could that doesn't have an absolute majority, that could be the ones, nevertheless, to try and find a coalition to rule the country. You could have something of a sort of a grand coalition, which would include the moderate left, the center, and the moderate right. But France is not really used to making coalitions. It's not how we work. It's not like in Israel. It's not like in Germany or other European countries. Or we could have a third option, again, one that we've not had previously in the Fifth Republic. It's called something like a technical government, as it was the case, for example, in Italy under the Draghi government. But all this to say is, while it has maybe clarified something, it's also pretty clear that we are now in an unprecedented situation and probably a little bit stuck.
So what do these results mean for the French Jewish community?
Now, first of all, I'd say that many Jews, after the second round of the elections, probably felt just as much of the country a sigh of relief. Many, again, in between the two rounds, everybody was talking about the fact that whether the National Rally would have an absolute majority, we would have Prime Minister Bardella from the far right ruling the country, what it would mean, and that's not happening. So I think a majority of French Jews, again, just as a majority of French people, probably are somewhat relieved. But I think it was very quickly gained by a sense of worry because of the presence of the far left Unbowed party in the left coalition that is now the largest part. And so many, many questions arise because we know that in that part of the coalition, there are very, very, very problematic elements, particularly with relations to Jews and anti-Semitism. They have really made sort of, anti-Israelism or even anti-Semitism a core part of the ideology. And I think more largely, I'd say, Jews, I think, are very, very uncomfortable. We were really, the Jewish question, if I may put it that way, was really at the center of this election. It was all day long about which party is anti-Semitic, which party isn't, who is trying to get the attention of the Jews. And so many people around us, around me, really had the impression that they were being instrumentalized in a very, very horrible manner. And I think the large feeling within the Jewish community is uncomfortable. They are afraid. And all of this also, particularly in a context where we have an explosion of anti-Semitism. Let me remind you that in 2023, since October 7th, we had a 1,000% increase of anti-Semitic acts in that year. Already in the first month of 2024, we have a 300% increase of anti-Semitism. And so, while this would usually require a very serious approach from all political parties to deal with this very profound threat for Jews and more largely, I think, for the country. Instead, what we are seeing is really the instrumentalization, the politicization of anti-Semitism, which really makes many, many, many Jews extremely uncomfortable.
So are you saying that that question of who is more anti-Semitic, the right, the left, was not actually, that question was not coming from the Jewish community, it was coming from another source, from, I mean, what were the origins of that question? And why is anti-Semitism the sin that is being instrumentalized?
So first of all, you have to understand that the far left party from Jean-Luc Mélenchon has really used the issue of Gaza and of the Palestinians as a weapon. It's not about the Palestinians. It's about, how can I call it, Palestinianism. It's really become sort of a cultural marker for that party, constantly being at the border of anti-Semitism. So you have, for example, people within his party who considered that the October 7th terrorist attacks were not terrorist. You have those who say that it was actually resistance. You have those who denied that babies were killed. You have those who consider that the acts of Hamas were actually legitimate. And so in the coming up before in particular, the European parliamentary elections that then led to the dissolution of the parliament, you really had that being the main issue, and it created within the Jewish community a really horrific feeling. And on the other side of the political spectrum, Marine Le Pen and Bardella really made the issue of anti-Semitism, positioned themselves as basically the defenders, the protectors of the Jews, all while at the same time still having elements within her own party that were clearly problematic and anti-Semitic. But in the words that they used and the way that they portrayed themselves, they were trying to portray themselves as a way of being serious, as a way of being the protector of the Jews, because the National Front also knows that this is the best way for them to become normalized, to become a regular party that can actually be taken seriously by large parts of the French society. So basically, everybody was pulling at the Jews on all sides. And we all know that whenever you make the issue of anti-Semitism a political issue, basically a political football game or baseball game in the American context, it means that you're actually not serious about anti-Semitism. If people on the right are not able to look anti-Semitism into the eye and actually say that anti-Semitism is a problem within their own camp, then they're not serious, because they only use anti-Semitism as a political game, as a political goal. And the same can be said on the left. The left, in particular the far left, always pretends not to be anti-Semitic, says how is it even possible that anyone could believe they would be anti-Semitic, while they only believe that anti-Semitism only exists on the right and on the far right. So it's very problematic, because again, in the middle, there are actually Jewish citizens who the only thing they want is for everybody within the French society to take anti-Semitism seriously, and to fight it collectively, knowing in particular that anti-Semitism is always the canary in the coal mine, that it's always the problem of society at large, and should therefore be taken seriously by everybody. But that's unfortunately not what's happening today. And it has created this incredible unease of many French Jews today.
I mean, it is well known, the history of anti-Semitism within France's far-right party. Jean-Marie Le Pen, Marine Le Pen's father, was repeatedly convicted for hate speech, Holocaust denial. And it does appear that his daughter, Marine Le Pen, has taken steps to distance her party from that history. She's expressed support for Israel. She's expressed support for France's Jewish community, as you said. Are you saying that it's really nothing more than a political strategy, a facade? Or do you think there is an authentic evolution of principles in her party that has some residual anti-Semitism from this long history?
Listen, first of all, it's better to have a party to say what they say than the opposite. Let's be very clear about that. It's better to have Marine Le Pen and Bardella say the same things that they say, meaning expressing support for the Jewish community, expressing support for Israel, than the opposite, as her father used to say, who used to consider that the gas chambers were just a detail in history. But nevertheless, I spoke about the fact that Emmanuel Macron, in his decision to call for snap elections, has wanted to clarify things. And once the focus came back to actually looking at the party and looking at the candidates of those that are actually presented by the National Rally as being candidates for the parliamentary elections, you could see that the problems were still there. So it's one thing to talk the talk, which is good. And again, I want to take this seriously. But at the same time, when you give nearly 100 seats to elements within your own party who are clearly problematic. I mean, we had a woman who wore a Nazi cap, like an actually cap from the Nazi area, and took a picture of herself and posted it on social media. You have Holocaust deniers. You have people who actually had a library with where they sell Holocaust denying books, and the list goes on. You can't just consider that this is just residual, that this is just a small problem. And again, I think for the party to really be taken seriously and really make sure that to know that what they're doing is genuine, they will have to have a very serious inwards-looking approach, meaning not using the issue of anti-Semitism and considering that it only exists ever on the far left, or that it only exists only with an Islamist element within the society, but actually agree and actually understand that it exists within their own ranks. Once that happens, we can take them a little bit more seriously, and we know that this will not only be part of a political strategy. In the meantime, I think we need to stay vigilant and call them out whenever that's necessary. That's one thing. The other thing is the National Front has also not been very, very clear on some of the issues we care about, very, very concrete issues. While there has been, going back and forth on what they actually mean. But for example, in the past, the National Rally has spoken about the fact of banning kosher meat in France. Not only the production of kosher meat, but even the importation of kosher meat. They have spoken about the fact of banning all religious symbols in the streets of France. Of course, their first target is the headscarf. But you can't just ban the headscarf. In that case, you would also have to ban the kippah in the public space. And more generally, I think the question arises for French Jews, whether this aligns actually with French values or with Jewish values. Having a party that actually considered to have a very nationalistic approach to politics, that considers that not all citizens are actually equal. One of the big things during the campaign was, for example, to consider that dual citizens should be banned from having certain jobs. Well, you can see that this is a really, a little bit of a xenophobic approach that doesn't go well with Jewish values, whether it targets Jews or not, but it doesn't go well with Jewish values. Now, again, that doesn't mean that the National Rally is incapable of evolving, but I think at this stage, we are not yet there.
That's a really helpful analysis of the far right and kind of their the direction that they're taking. So now let's turn to the left. And I I have to say, I used the word residual in my previous question on purpose, because that was a word that Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the far left leader, used to describe anti-Semitism in France. It's not rising, it's just residual. He's also called Israel's operation in Gaza genocide. I'm curious, should we be concerned about the far left's first place result? And I mean, what could be the ramifications of a far left victory in 2027 in the presidential election?
So listen, we at AJC we did a survey, our biannual survey that we do together with Fondapol and IFOP, one of the largest polling institutes in France, and we found that 92% of French Jews consider Jean-Luc Mélenchon's Unbowed Party to be the main reason why anti-Semitism is growing in the political sphere. So 92% of French Jews consider it to be anti-Semitic. A large majority, also 54% of French Jews, when they're being asked, is whether if Jean-Luc Mélenchon was to be president of France, would they leave the country or not? 55% say they would. So this is very, very clear. French Jews are very concerned about the far left. The different comments by himself, whether it's because he called, for example, when Jeremy Corbyn lost the election in the United Kingdom, at the time he said that the reason why he lost the elections was because of the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, or because of the networks of the Likud. He, as you said, he's spoken about a Gaza genocide, but that's happening basically every single day. He considers anti-Semitism to be residual, while knowing that 1,000% increase in anti-Semitism has happened since October 7th. He has used the issue of Gaza, of the Palestinians, really as a political game. To create chaos within its parliament. He has had, they have had Palestinian flags. They have called for Israel to be an apartheid state. I mean, this is basically happening every single day. So this is why Jews in France are extremely concerned and consider the far left to be the main cause of anti-Semitism today in the French political sphere. Now, what is very, very concerning, and this is we are paying the consequences today, is that when after the first round of the parliamentary elections, the traditional left-wing parties, meaning the socialists, the Green, the small Communist Party, decided to make an alliance with Jean-Luc Mélenchon's party, this was another, not only a feeling of concern for French Jews, but probably a feeling of betrayal. Because it means that the moderate left does not consider anti-Semitism to be a red line. It doesn't consider anti-Semitism to be so important for it not to create an alliance with a party that has very clearly made anti-Semitism one of its major causes. And let's be clear, in the Socialist Party, you have, for example, François Hollande, the former president of France, who was just elected in parliament again, and who has, indirectly considered that anti-Semitism is not a red line for him, and therefore has decided to create an alliance with the far left. So for French Jews, it's both a sense of fear, but also clearly a sense of betrayal. Because what is the message not only to the French left, but what is the message to the rest of society? If you consider anti-Semitism not to be a red line, how do you want to continue to explain to the rest of society, to French children, that anti-Semitism needs to be fought, that this is a priority for the country as such, if you don't consider it to be a red line? So we are now living with these consequences, and therefore the question arises: who will be in the government? Will it be, the far left, the Jean-Luc Mélenchon, or will, after the second round of the elections, the traditional moderate left decide to split off and take its distance with their party, or again continue in the same way as they have until today? But it's a major issue, and one that we will possibly pay the price for in the future. Again, beyond the very political issue, but in the country as such.
So what role did the Israel-Hamas war play in this election and its outcome?
It was in particular for the European parliamentary election, the main issue. Again, the main issue for the far left. The far left had a candidate, a Palestinian woman by the name of Rima Hassan, who has a very, very radical approach to the Palestinian issue, considers that there needs to be a Palestinian state from the river to the sea. And this was really sort of the poster child of the unbowed party from Jean-Luc Mélenchon. So it played a major role. And more largely, the issue of anti-Semitism played a role on the other side by all of the other parties, because again, we've had obviously the increase of anti-Semitism, but we also had horrible cases, high-profile cases of anti-Semitism that came out in the public. We know, for example, of this horrible case of a 12-year-old Jewish girl who was raped by 3 boys of 12 and 13 years old, who hurled anti-Semitic insults and raped her. So all of this has really taken a center stage in the election, again, which makes many French people at unease. I mean, so many friends of mine just said, I wish we would be talking about something else. When can we stop talking about the Jews all day long?
So I have a feeling we could talk about France and what has gone down there for hours and hours, but it's not the only country in Europe. No. I want to also look at the United Kingdom, another major country that also had elections last week. The UK Labour Party had a major victory, ending 14 years of conservative rule. What can you tell us about that election and its results?
Yes, you're right. This is major. The Labour Party, led by Sir Keir Starmer, really scored a resounding victory in the general elections. Its majority is the largest one by any government since 1997. The party flipped seats in all corners, really, of the United Kingdom, defeating Conservative candidates in constituencies that had been conservative since really the 19th century. Labour victory was nevertheless as much of really conservative defeat. The conservative vote collapsed by nearly 20 percentage points. It's the largest decline by any governing party in British political history. And voters abandoned the party not only in favor of the Labour Party, but also for other parties, for the Liberal Democrats, for Reform UK, and also for the Green Party. And also plenty stayed at home. Fewer than 3/5 of the voters turned out to vote. And it's the second lowest turnout in the past century, which is really sort of a sign of a problem within British democracy as well. Now, the Liberal Democrats took 60 seats held by the Conservatives. The party increased its representation in the House of Commons from 11 seats in 2019 to 72. And seats in which the Liberal Democrats were competing against the Conservative really saw a substantial tactical voting to oust the governing party. In the seats, the Tories voted share fell by an average of 24 percentage points, while that of the Liberal Democrats increased by 12. Also, the Reform Party, Eurosceptic, rather pro-Russian anti-immigration party that was led by Nigel Farage, was the biggest beneficiary of the Conservative collapse in terms of vote share. Reform achieved 14% of the vote nationwide, which is basically 12 points compared with the Brexit party that Nigel Farage used in 2019. So this is basically what we're at. I think, nevertheless, the interesting thing, though, I think for the Labour Party in particular, is that we see to some extent that when Labour becomes a normal social democratic center-left party, it can win elections, which wasn't the case under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, where the Labour Party very, very clearly lost the elections.
But now Jeremy Corbyn, as you mentioned earlier, very troubling history of anti-Semitism that spread throughout that party. So what should we know about the new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, and his solutions?
Sorry. So first of all, since taking over the Labour leadership from Jeremy Corbyn in 2019, it needs to be very clearly said that Keir Starmer has made the issue of anti-Semitism a top priority. The party under Jeremy Corbyn had really become, one could say, institutionally anti-Semitic. And one of the first actions as Keir Starmer took over the party was a public apology to the Jewish community, calling anti-Semitism a stain on the party that needed to be eradicated. And so I think as such, that needs to be clearly noted. Before Starmer also took over, before he now became Prime Minister, it's also important to note that the Jewish Labour MPs like Luciana Berger, like Louise Almond, who had left the party under Jeremy Corbyn because basically they were being harassed because the party had really become institutionally anti-Semitic, have decided to come back. So I think it's really sort of an endorsement of Labour as sort of a renewed confidence in the party's election. So I think overall the Jewish community is in the United Kingdom somewhat reassured by the stance that Keir Starmer has taken since he has taken over the party, and there is no reason to believe that he will take a different stance. One should also probably note, even though this is of course his personal life, that Sir Keir Starmer knows the Jewish community very well. His wife is Jewish. She is the daughter of a Polish British Jew, who had emigrated to the United Kingdom in the 20s, who then was married to a non-Jewish woman who then converted to Judaism. So she was brought up Jewish. She is involved in Jewish community affairs. Keir Starmer has had in the past said that he would stop working at 6 p.m. on Friday night in order to be able to be with his family for Shabbat dinner. So, you know, it is nevertheless quite significant, particularly knowing where the Labour Party was only a few years ago under Jeremy Corbyn. So this is of course an important sign. That being said, there will also be pressure, without a doubt, from other elements in the party, as I just said, in the political spectrum. Sorry, as I just said, there are other parties who did particularly well: the Green Party, the Reform Party, the Liberal Democrats, and there will be pressure, nevertheless, on many of the issues that, in particular, on foreign policy with relations to Israel and Gaza, that will be made. But overall, I think many in the Jewish community are reassured about the fact that the Labour Party was somehow cleansed of the most problematic anti-Semitic elements within the party.
So put this all in context for us, Simone. How do these elections fit in with what we're seeing across the continent, from the recent EU Parliament elections to the Dutch elections? The Dutch just swore in a new right-wing government that includes Geert Wilders. Explain how this all fits in together.
Okay, let me just dial back one thing about the British election that I haven't mentioned so far, and it's the fact that we nevertheless see a polarization, just as we see that we have seen now in France, just as we see across the continent. We can even say that there is a sense of sectorization, or sectarian approach to British politics, where candidates try to appeal to different parts within the British electorate, in particular to Muslim voters, campaigning on Gaza, and all of this had nevertheless a pretty significant impact on the British elections, because there were two candidates in particular that from the Labour Party that lost their seats because they were defeated, because of some of the campaign that were done by clearly Islamist elements within British society, who managed to do so, who sort of used the electorate to vote against the Labour Party with their new approach. So there is sort of a sectarian approach now in British politics. But to bring it back to, I think, to the wider question that you asked, there is clearly across the continent a huge polarization. We see that, and I believe this is part of the crisis that we are seeing across Western democracies. We see radicalization of the political spectrum. We see a certain inability for people to even talk with each other, to even share a common sense of reality, or even a common sense of shared values. And I think this is really what we are seeing across the European continent, and probably more widely across Western democracies. And this, I think, needs to be seen particularly also in a wider geopolitical point of view. We are clearly witnessing these days an assault by autocratic nations or groups across the world who have decided to team up despite their differences, and to attack the Western world for their hegemony, to attack the Western world because they want to change the world order. So, of course, militarily, by the war that is being waged by Russia against Ukraine, the war that is also being waged by Iranian proxies against Israel, Hamas, of course, since October 7th, but also Hezbollah, the Houthis, et cetera, and they are really, I think, trying to test the grounds. We see those autocrats teaming up, Russia, Iran, North Korea, China to some extent, waging this war against the West. And we in the West really falling apart to some extent from within, both because there is a hybrid war that is being waged by those autocratic elements and countries from the outside, but also because we ourselves have our own huge problems, of course, as we know. And there, I think this is what we are seeing. This is also the polarization of the political spectrum. And the fact that the far right is gaining more and more ground is part of that. It's part of the fact that many European citizens feel that what they used to believe Europe was about is falling apart. There is a lot of cultural insecurity. There's a lot of fear. And to some extent, the job that by the sort of traditional conservative and liberal parties on the left and right that should have been there to address the concerns of European citizens, whether it's on immigration, whether it's on globalization, whether it's about the middle class, have not been addressed by those parties. The reaffirmation of the European values have not often been addressed by those parties. And so in this vacuum and in this wider geopolitical context, the populist parties are exploiting that part. So my appeal to European and Western democracies and Western parties who care about Western values and European values is to start addressing the issues from within, stand up for themselves, stand up for their minorities, and in particular Jews, knowing that anti-Semitism is always the first sign of societies falling apart, and deal with the very serious threats that are coming from the outside and stand firm, because we are probably at a crossroad of the world as we know it.
It's not lost on me that we've been sitting here talking about far left and far right victories and losses. What about the centrists like Macron? I mean, should we be concerned that the gravitas of the centrist point of view, which of course is AJC's hallmark, should we be concerned that that's fading or at least on the downward swing?
Yes, and it relates back to what I just said early on. I think we should be. We should very much be, because of the polarization, because of the radicalization of the political spectrum, the center, left, and parties are failing. But again, I think, you know, it's the responsibility certainly of those parties. It's certainly also due to, you know, hybrid wars waged by us, by foreign countries, including in particular, of course, by Russia. But it's also because those centrist parties have sort of shied away of dealing with some of the more difficult questions that are then being exploited by populists. Again, whether it's the issue of immigration, the issue of integration, the issue of identity, the issue of globalization, the sense that people are losing their national identities and culture, the cherishing of our own values, all of this, if this is not being addressed by the centrist parties and just being brushed off as, you know, whatever, far right, then we have a problem. It is only if there is no vacuum that is being left to the populists, whether they are on the left or on the right, that I think we stand a chance for the center to hold and to make sure that there is actually a possible, you know, negotiations between both sides of the center, a debate that is taking place, and not just a shouting match as we often have between radical parties on both sides of the political spectrum. This will absolutely be, I think, crucial going down the line if we want to hold the center, is for the center to take seriously the very fundamental issues, difficult questions to address that are so often exploited by populist parties across the spectrum.
Simone, thank you so much for shedding light on all of these developments overseas. I will now turn it over to Claire to relay some questions from our audience.
Manya. Barry Weinberger in Boston is asking, is it inevitable that America will follow the path of these European countries, or is there something about our democracy and pluralism that sets us apart? And how do you anticipate these European relationships to change if the US has a change in leadership in November?
So first of all, I think we live in a globalized world, and what we are seeing these days unfolding in Europe, we see often also happening in the United States. By the way, I think more widely, we are seeing this across Western democracies, whether it's on this side of the Atlantic or on the other side of the Atlantic. Is there something specific in the American system that can uphold? I hope so. But I think the same issues, the same problems that arise, meaning the radicalization of the spectrum, meaning the inability to uphold the very idea of what is America is about, the ability to speak between the center right and the center left, to come to compromise, the need to sort of be in agreement on some of the fundamental issues you care about. All of this is also problematic, I think, in the United States. And again, I want to point to the issue of social media, which I think has become truly problematic because people are not seeing the same reality. People live in their information bubbles. People live in a world of where their own ideas are being reconfirmed or confirmed by what they're seeing on social media, and there is the need of the need of having important democratic debates between different point of views has slightly disappeared, I think, with social media. So it's a challenge. I think the one thing that I cherish particular in American democracy, and which maybe gives me a little bit of hope, is the ability to be to react, to be more flexible. Europe is a very old continent, and there is sometimes sort of everything becomes sometimes is very rigid. But in the US, I sometimes have the impression that things can sometimes be radical, but they counterbalance each other, and sometimes you sort of fall back into a normal way of functioning. That's my hope. But I think again, it's crucial for all Western democracies to really sort of come back of who we are, to reaffirm whether it's French values, whether it's British values, whether it's German values, whether it's Austrian values, whether it's American values, which are basically the values that we have shared all together since the end of the World War, and really try and reaffirm those, try and reinterpret those in a more positive way, not be ashamed of who we are. Democracy, as Churchill said, is not perfect, but it's still the best solution out of everything that we have that has been established since. So I think we need to be proud of who we are, of what we are, try and come back to who we are, and maybe there is still a chance for that. And then of course the issue of anti-Semitism. As I said, anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine. If Jews are unsafe in any society, society at large will not be safe. And Claire, you have to remind me of the second question.
How do you anticipate the European relationships to change if the US has a change in leadership in November?
Listen, there is definitely nervousness here in Europe about the elections. I would overall think that while the first time around, most Europeans were very surprised by the presidential elections when Donald Trump won. I think they are more prepared these days. They know what to expect. And they are preparing, I think, themselves about the future. There's, of course, worry or nervousness about NATO, about potentially for President Trump's commitment to NATO. There is also, of course, worry about continued American support for Ukraine, which again is not only about Ukraine, but far more largely about the continent itself. If Russia was ever allowed to win this war, there is no doubt about the fact that Ukraine won't be the last country to be waged war against. So I overall think that there is nervousness, but more preparedness than last time around.
Our next question is from Laura Perlman in Chicago, who's asking, can you touch a little more on the results of the European Parliament elections from early June? What were the major shifts and what changes should we expect to see in EU policy or collaboration, if at all? Also, what role did the war in Ukraine play in those results?
Overall, the European parliamentary elections have not created a huge change. There is definitely a larger majority, a larger part of far-right parties that have gained ground in the European Parliament, whether they're from France, from Germany, from the Netherlands, from elsewhere. The populist right-wing parties have definitely gained more ground. They will now together form the third largest party in the European Parliament. But overall, the PPE, so the conservative, will continue to be the strongest party in the European Parliament. I do not believe that there will be a huge shift in that approach. We can also expect the European Parliament, as it is under this election, more friendly, I would say, towards Israel than under the previous European Parliament, not hugely, but to some extent. There is some worry, nevertheless, of course, about the issue of Ukraine. As I said, the third largest party was created by populist right-wing parties, under which there are parties that are much more skeptical towards very strong support towards Ukraine, who have had a tendency to play towards Russia a little bit, who have in the past tried to prevent too much support, including support of arms and money to Ukraine. And those parties, as the fact that they are teaming up, are now the third largest party, can play a certain role. I don't expect it to be too strong, because the rest of the parliament is still, I think, strongly in support of Ukraine, but nevertheless more than in under the previous European Parliament. And also, to some extent, there is also a certain Ukraine fatigue that is, of course, setting in. The war is going on as long, has its consequences, including, of course, in terms of inflation in Europe. But still, nevertheless, I'd say there's no dramatic change in support for Ukraine.
And Bandler is asking, Simone, you have long maintained that French Jews should stay in France, but is the community now facing a turning point? What would you say to those, including Israeli officials, who are calling for French Jews to make Aliyah?
So first of all, I have always had the same point of view, and I would never change that, or at least not now. That I would never advise anyone to do anything. I think it's a very personal, very individual decision that people are taking and should be taking. There is no doubt about the fact that many Jews ask themselves the question whether they have a future in France. But just as I always believe that anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine, and that we are living in a globalized world, I think if we lose France, and if we lose France's Jewish community, there is not a lot of hope for the rest of the Western world. I have said this for years and years and years. We live in a globalized world, and this is, I think, something that we've seen since October 7th. What we are experiencing in France is not contained to France. We see it in Germany. We see it in the United Kingdom. We see it in the United States. We see it in Australia. We see it everywhere in the world. And so what? Everybody is supposed to leave? I don't believe in that. I think that's, at least that's my personal point of view. I think that we need to fight. I think that if Jews will have to move, it will mean the end of France, it will mean the end of Europe, it will mean the end of the Western world. And I don't think any of us can afford it. And by the way, I also don't think that Israel can afford it. So that's my personal point of view. I believe that I will, and I will continue to fight it as much as we can. But again, I understand every single Jew who asks themselves the question, even those who are deciding to leave. And I'm sure we will have an increase of people who are leaving. I'm sure that we will have an increase not only of Aliyah, but people who are Jews who will be leaving elsewhere. Without a doubt, because of course Jews are afraid, and you can have all of the spiritual and philosophical questions and recommendations for yourself that you can have, but at the end of the day, you have to make a choice for your own family and the future of your children. So I'm sure that there will be people who are leaving, particularly if things become more problematic on the political level. I think the one point where I would probably say that France is lost if there's ever to be institutional anti-Semitism, meaning that if we ever have a government in place that is institutionally anti-Semitic. In that case, I believe that there is absolutely no future there, and that in that case we'll all have to go join the resistance movements as we have had in the past in Europe.
Question before I turn it back to you, Manya, is what positive changes or hopeful outcomes can we expect to see from the results of the elections in France, the UK, the European Parliament, and elsewhere?
Listen, I think the reality is of everything as scary and as negative as I just described, there is still a majority of Europeans, of French people, of British people who share the values that we share, who believe that the fight against anti-Semitism is important. AJC has many friends, has many allies. Many have spoken out, whether our journalist friends, whether our members of parliament friends, whether our minister friends, whether our former prime minister friends. The support for Jews is still large. We have seen it again in our survey that we did for AJC, where we saw that 76% of French Jews consider anti-Semitism to be the problem, not only of Jews alone, but of French society at large. So I think that the public as such still is largely with us, with the Jews, considers that anti-Semitism is a stain not only on for Jews, but for their own country. The question is, how do we mobilize them? The question is, how do we make sure that they are as largely represented as possible, and really encourage the center voices, those voices, the allies, to speak up, to be bold, to be courageous, to make sure that red lines are not being crossed. And that will be really the challenge, I think, of AJC today, tomorrow, and in the years to come.
Thank you. Back to you, Manya.
Wonderful questions from our audience and our former colleague, Ken Bandler. Thank you for adding your journalistic instincts. And once again, thank you, Simone, for joining us and informing all of our conversations on these matters. Claire?
And Simone for today's timely and insightful conversation. And thank you to our global audience for tuning in. To stay up to date on this issue and more, please follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram by searching AJC Global, or you can learn more at ajc.org/European elections. Thank you again, and goodbye.